Keith, what was it like? What did it mean to you when you hear about a non-WWE, WWF show being held at Madison Square Garden? It's been so long. WWE, WWF has just had a hold on MSG, and Ring of Honor and New Japan Pro Wrestling, they do the G1 Supercard, and it's at Madison Square Garden.
Well, I was there, and it's described in the book, and it was WrestleMania weekend, because there were already people I knew from all over the world who were in town. They were in town for WrestleMania and all the other events. What's been unique about indie wrestling is they piggybacked on WrestleMania, and as a result, there are dozens of related shows in the same town or the same vicinity as WrestleMania every year, pre-pandemic, of course. So here we were in Madison Square Garden, and I'd never been in the Garden for a non-WWE show. Now, I believe the last time that there was it's actually in the book. The last time someone other than the McMahon family promoted a show in the Garden was in 1960, I believe. And then it was Jack Pepper and Pedro Martinez were the promoters, and they very quickly burned the fans out, couldn't draw, and pretty soon Vince and James McMahon and Toots Mondt, his partner, were back in business in the Garden, and the McMahons never left. So it was bizarre, because even when I was growing up, I remember there was a renegade promotion called the IWA, and they had some good talent. Ernie Ladd was there, Ivan Koloff was there, the Mongol brothers were there, and Bulldog Brower was there, Bill Mossberg was there. They could not get into Madison Square Garden. They would hold their shows at the outdoor baseball stadium in Jersey City. And so to be in Madison Square Garden and to see it packed for a non-WWE show was something I'd never anticipated. And what was even more memorable was the fact that the prestigious IWGP title, New Japan's title, changed hands on foreign soil in Madison Square Garden. Kazuchika Okada was crowned the champion in Madison Square Garden on WrestleMania.
Well, it's interesting you brought up IWA. Was that Pedro Martinez and Einhorn, or was that Joe Savoldi and the Savoldi family?
No, that was Pedro Martinez and Einhorn. And Johnny Powers was involved too, like, as a booker and as someone who was a perennial champ. And the IWA is mentioned in my book too, because I go through the history of what were called outlaw federations and indie promotions all the way back to the early 60s.
It's also in the book the Savoldi family and what they were able to do up in the tri-state area. I should have pursued the Savoldi family maybe in my next book. Do you remember anything? I won't discuss a lot about it because then it's not in the book, but do you ever go to any of their shows or remember them? I mean, they were a pretty decent outfit.
It was, and at one point, didn't they combine with WCCW with IWCW during the waning days of World Class? I believe they formed some type of allegiance with them.
That's interesting. Yeah, I did not know that with them, but that area, just so many groups.
In their group, they must have been on TV in New York for a while, because I remember watching their show.
They were on TV a little bit down here in South Florida. That's the only reason I knew about their company. You had to find it, but if you were searching channels and you had your TV guide and things back in the day, you could find something. I remember actually on our Spanish channels here being able to watch Lucha Libre from the Olympic Auditorium with the famous Jimmy Lennon Sr. as the ring announcer.
As did I. We had that on New York Spanish International Network, and that was where we were able to see professional wrestling on from the Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles. And that was a part of my childhood too, watching wrestling in Spanish from the Olympics. In fact, I would say I learned how to speak Spanish. I speak, not perfect Spanish, but I get by. I've been in Spanish countries and completely functioned, and that's from watching wrestling from the Olympic auditorium.
With Miami and such a big Spanish fan base, Latin fan base, it just seemed like the thing to do was to put Lucha Libre. They have their Spanish channels and do that. And I remember watching Chavo Guerrero Sr., Chavo Classic, and Roddy Piper, and Black Orban and Goliath, and some of the names that Mil Mascaras. That's how I became a fan of Mil Mascaras. Just an incredible style. But I always remember Jimmy Lennon Sr. as well, because Jimmy Lennon Jr. is doing well as a ring announcer these days with combat sports. And I remember his father was just one of the best at ring announcing. He was fantastic. And, it's funny because a lot of people say Howard Finkel was the greatest ring announcer of all time. And, in my life experience, I would say it's a toss-up between Howard Finkel and Jimmy Lennon. And as well as I knew Finkel and as much as I liked him personally, I would probably be more partial to Jimmy Lennon, probably because that's what I grew up watching, and so I idealize it, romanticize it more. And my analogy to your analogy would be Gordon Soley and Jim Ross. I think two of the best. But for me, it's Gordon Soley. Others, it would be Jim Ross. But I grew up with Gordon Soley, and I think they're both incredible. I'd put them both on the Mount Rushmore.
And I would wager to guess that Jim Ross might even put Gordon Soley above him.
And speaking...
I think I heard him make a Gordon Soley reference on a recent edition of AEW.
And speaking of Gordon Soley, what do you recall about Florida wrestling and anything about the CWF, Championship Wrestling from Florida? Did you ever get to see any of that? Did you ever get to experience any of that?
I did. I was very fortunate. When I was in 5th grade, I had an uncle who moved down to Florida to take a job at a baker at the Beau Rivage Hotel on Collins Avenue. And so my family began making a trip once a year to Florida. And then ultimately my grandparents, who were living in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, they moved down there as well. So Miami Beach Convention Center they had wrestling there every Wednesday night. And we were so into it as a family, we would sometimes book a trip where we would leave on a Wednesday morning, stay through the next Wednesday, and go home on a Thursday, so we could get 2 weeks in of wrestling rather than just simply one. So I was just looking at this. I knew I was going to be doing this interview. Some of the names I saw there, and I remember seeing, Buddy Colt and Tim Mr. Wrestling Woods, and Paul Jones, and the Hollywood Blondes, and later on Dusty Rhodes, and Kevin Sullivan, and Mike and Eddie Graham. And I remember it was, I believe, 1974, seeing a championship match between Jack Briscoe defending the title against Harley Race. And it was tense. It wasn't like today. People weren't laughing and joking like it was serious. It was an intense, violent wrestling match. And I remember a woman in the front row, she was shaking, and she came up the ringside, and she tried to put her hands on Harley Race because she was so upset by his underhanded tactics. And security, they didn't throw her out. They gently took her around the arms and, guided her into her seat. And she was quivering, and she may have actually been crying. And I remember that match ending when they were battling on the ring apron, and Harley Race went into the barricade, into the ring post, and got busted open. And he was laying there, and I believe he was counted out of the ring. And I remember walking out of there and feeling, well, it's a different type of wrestling than I'm accustomed to at the Garden. The Garden was great, and this convention hall was great, too.
Yeah, different style. I mean, they really went at it. I mean, Eddie Graham, and they really just went all out, very physical style down here. And that's where the American Dream, Dusty Rhodes, was born, actually, down here, transitioning from the heel to the great legend, babyface superstar that he became, pro wrestler he became. And you mentioned the Hollywood Blondes, and I'm wondering if that was the time, if you remember Sir Oliver Humperdinck.
Yes, that is the first Oliver Humperdinck.
There were two...
Yeah.
No, I was going to say, because mentioning Sir Oliver Humperdinck, one of the greatest heel managers of our time, there was also two guys, Jack and Jerry Briscoe, the Briscoe brothers. And they were phenomenal down here. And then they ended up helping reshape and redefine the pro wrestling industry.
Right, when they jumped ship and sold their points to Vince McMahon.
It's just so many amazing stories that morphed from championship wrestling from Florida. And it was just an unbelievable time. And Mike Graham, as you mentioned, and Steve Kern, another legend, Joe LeDuc, Ernie Ladd, Terry Funk, Abdul the Butcher, oh gosh, King Curtis, so many, Superstar Billy Graham and Dusty. I mean, so many classic battles down here and all. It was just a really cool time. Do you know much anything about the indies of Florida?
I don't know that much about indies in Florida. I remember a period after CWS folded when there would be, like Dusty had an indie at one point, if you recall. Remember?
Yes, Turnbuckle. He had Turnbuckle Pro.
Yeah. So I can remember, hearing about it. I did not attend any of those shows, unfortunately.
It's flourishing down here now. We have, well, not now because of the pandemic, but prior to the pandemic, we've had a lot of groups running, and it's interesting because you're seeing different fans at different indie shows, which I find interesting too, because in a radius of 30 miles, you have like 4 or 5 groups that were periodically running shows, which you would think on an indie level would just be suicide. But so far, they've been able to at least maintain. The crowds aren't... A couple of the companies draw well. The other ones are trying. But it's interesting down here to see that. But I think that's why I was leading to this. Do you think with WWE being so focal in Florida, Central Florida per se, and AEW doing its shows out of Jacksonville for now, and the connection with the Jacksonville Jaguars and the Khan family, do you think that opens the door to more wrestling, like indie wrestling, in Florida?
Well, it certainly could inspire people, because if you're an indie wrestler, you're thinking, well, maybe somebody from AEW or NXT will come to this indie show. I mean, in my book, I mention how, William Regal would regularly attend PWG shows in LA, and the wrestlers knew it, and they were performing for him, hoping that they'd get signed. So, with the 2 major companies in Florida now, you would think it's a pretty good place to showcase your skills.
Keith Elliot Greenberg is a New York Times bestselling author and television producer who wrote for WWE's publications and others for decades and co-authored the autobiographies of WWE Hall of Famers Ric Flair, Freddie Blassie, as he mentioned, and Superstar Billy Graham, as well as the 3rd edition. I have this one, by the way. It's great. I have the Blassie and Flair books, too. I don't think I have the Superstar Billy Graham. But anyway, the 3rd edition of the WWE Encyclopedia of Sports Entertainment, which is awesome. So, Keith, how do you get involved with WWE?
Well, I was already freelancing, and I was writing about professional wrestling. By that stage, I was in my early 20s, and around the time of the first WrestleMania, I was covering the first WrestleMania for Us Weekly, and I was sitting next to Ed Raschuti, who was the editor of the WWF magazine. And we were chatting, and he's like, why don't you just write for us? And then I did an article or two for WWF magazine, and then he goes, why don't we put you on retainer and you can write for us every month? And then I was, I was on retainer for them for 22 years.
That's incredible. And it's something like, it's not so much you're seeking out that opportunity, it just sort of happened. And it's just...
Right, I didn't go to WrestleMania 1 thinking I was going to leave, right, with an offer to write for the WWF magazine. I was content at the time to write about wrestling from a distance, but working for the WWF magazine, I got to be backstage during, some pretty vibrant times. And, I got a real insider's view, and that was how I was then able to write Freddie Black, Ric Flair, and superstar Billy Graham's book with them.
And that WrestleMania 1, Liberace, Billy Martin, Muhammad Ali.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember the excitement, and I remember, it's funny, it was still, in some ways, a reflection of the time. Like, there were matches that were not main event caliber matches. They were opening matches, preliminary matches. While they were warming up the crowd. Matches you wouldn't see now. But the overall mood was exuberant. And you also had celebrities, real celebrities, people who were celebrities of the time. Cyndi Lauper, who was a giant pop star, and Mr. T, who was one of the top television stars, participating in the matches. So previously, you'd see a celebrity get involved in wrestling, and maybe they were a B-level celebrity, or there was somebody who might pass their prime. In this case, these were people in their prime, and they were endorsing professional wrestling, saying this is a hip thing to watch. And, Vince McMahon was well aware of it, and that was when professional wrestling changed, and depending on your worldview, either for the better or for the worse.
Couple more questions, we'll let you get out of here. And again, Too Sweet, Inside the Indie Wrestling Revolution by noted historian, author, New York Times bestselling author, Keith Elliot Greenberg. Check out any of his work. It's really, really good. Keith, in mentioning that, did you ever fathom, it's easy to say now, but did you ever fathom when you went to WrestleMania 1 that it was going to turn into what it's become today?
No. In fact, I remember Ed Raschuti and I, the editor of the WWF magazine, at WrestleMania 1, having this very conversation. And I said to Ed, how many WrestleManias will there be? Will there be a WrestleMania 2? Or is this the peak? Is this the height of wrestling's popularity today? Because some people thought that. And Ed Raschuti said, yeah, there'll be 3 WrestleManias. 1 more year to go up, 1 year to go down. There'll be 3 WrestleManias. Interest will have waned by WrestleMania 3. And then, wrestling will go back to what it was. And that was his prediction. And I remember around that time being on vacation in Puerto Rico, but I went to wrestling because I'm a mark. And
Carlos Colon.
And staying at my hotel was Abdullah the Butcher. And I ended up in Abdullah's room smoking cigars with him and having this very talk. And he was like, they're spending too much money. It's not going to last. The fans, they're just going to burn the people out. They're giving away too much. WWF, I don't know. I don't think they're going to do that well in a few years. But if you see Vince, mention it, get you right into it.
Keith, that's because Abby didn't want to spend any money.
Yeah, I know.
I'm sorry, I took a pause because I was trying not to laugh because I wanted to hear you, because when you mentioned Abdullah the Butcher mentioning about money, that's the first thing that popped in my head was how...
Well, he loves to talk about money.
No, but how frugal he was with his...
Yeah.
Okay, all right, so I got to wrap this up with you. Thank you so much for the time. Hey, you mentioned, we talked about Ali, and I brought up Dusty Rhodes. You mentioned Dusty Rhodes. To me, it's interesting. Muhammad Ali was big pro wrestling fan. Dusty Rhodes, superstar Billy Graham, they all had that type of trash-talking gift for gab. Do you foresee that as coming from Thunderbolt Patterson? Thunderbolt Patterson talk like that. And I've read stories out there where they've all borrowed, you borrow from each other, so it's not stealing. But I'm just curious, as a historian, do you know anything along those lines? Like, yeah, Ali and Dusty and Superstar took from Thunderbolt, or Ali took from Dusty and Superstar, who took from Thunderbolt.
I co-wrote Superstar Billy Graham's book, and he said him and Dusty, and I co-wrote Flair's book, and both of them said they liberally took from Dusty in their promos, because Dusty was an inspiration, and Dusty could talk. And one thing that Superstar Billy Graham said, that him and Dusty were big Bob Dylan fans, and they would sometimes lift a phrase from a Bob Dylan song and use it in a promo, and they'd crack each other up because only they were in on the joke.
Hey, Keith, you said you attended college. Where did you go to college, and what did you get your degree in?
I got a degree. I started at Queens College, and I got a degree in communications journalism.
Now, which extended yourself into the life here that you were able to lead. I was curious because I didn't know what field. There are lawyers that have become excellent writers as well, so I didn't know what field you went into there.
Yes, I did end up. I started out as a fine arts major, and I ended up a journalism major.
And Keith, also, in closing, what would you like to tell people about Too Sweet inside the indie wrestling revolution?
I would say, if you want to see, if you want, I'm going to rephrase it. I feel that Too Sweet inside the indie wrestling revolution is a snapshot of our times and times past. I think it brings the indie wrestling scene to prominence, the prominence that it deserves, and it explains how, as a genre, professional wrestling evolved to this point. And in some ways, despite the pandemic, this is one of the most exciting times in professional wrestling, and I believe that my book brings it.
Well, and Keith, I know I want to wrap this up, and you've been so gracious with your time, but how has social media helped indie wrestling and indie wrestlers?
In my book, I discuss the impact of social media extensively, because in times past, you could be a great wrestler, but if you happen to be in a part of the world where wrestling wasn't that visible, you could work in obscurity. Nowadays, with social media, somebody does a flashy move in a show in Melbourne, Australia, and, before the pandemic, a month and a half later, they could be on a PWG show in Los Angeles, and 2 months after that, they could be in NXT. So that's all through social media. And wrestlers talk about how they used to have to send a VHS tape, a highlight reel, along with an 8x10. Now they can put something up on YouTube and everybody can find out about it.
It's such changing times, and I think for the better, which is good. So more,
I would say,
yeah, more can make money and make a living off of it.
Perspective and from a wrestler perspective. And one other point I'd like to make is that the caliber of promoter has gone up, because if you are ripping off the boys, that will go up on social media, and the better wrestlers won't want to work for you. So as a result, the promoters know to keep it honest, and the wrestlers know that these are people we can trust.
Well, awesome stuff. Keith Elliot Greenberg, I could talk to you for hours, sir.
I know.
Too Sweet inside the indie wrestling revolution. Publication date will be September 1st. Check it out. ECW press offering. All his work is excellent. So anything, when you see the name Keith Elliot Greenberg on it, you got to check it out. And Keith, I'll leave you with this. I got to speak to Dusty a few times being in South Florida here, and he mentioned that one of the plans was not to have Ali versus Inoki, but they were trying to set it up because Ali was in training in Miami. Fifth Street Gym, famous gym with Angelo Dundee, and since Dusty was so big with...
Because his brother was the promoter
You got it. You got it. His brother, Angelo's brother, was the promoter and all. Chris Dundee. That's right. Chris was. And they were actually, originally they were trying to set it up, Dusty versus Ali, but the business and the money was too big to pass up for Ali to go to Japan and work Inoki.
That would make sense because, you know, Chris Dundee wasn't going to pay Ali millions of dollars to, you know, to have the show even at the Orange Bowl.
Well, Keith, thank you so much for the time. Anything you'd like to add in closing? I don't know if you have any social media out there for fans or anything like that?
Yes, yes. Obviously, my book can be ordered. My book, C-Suite, Inside the Indie Wrestling Revolution, can be ordered either through Amazon. It can be ordered through the publisher, ECW Press. And if there's a brick-and-mortar bookstore that's open near you, go inside and you'll find.
Thank you so much, Keith.
Thank you. Is this going to be in the newspaper, in the Miami Herald as well?